Order. Welcome to this afternoon's session, which is about Army 2020. And it is very helpful to have all of you to give an external view from that of the Ministry of Defence about the proposals which the armed forces have for the future Army 2020. And so I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking, we've been told by General Wall that this proposal is a radical one. How radical would you say it is? Now, by the way, you don't have to each answer every question, because I'm afraid we're going to have to get through this first session by about 10 to 3, because we have conflicts with the Defence Reform Bill that's also sitting today. We've got a further panel, so please do not feel you each have to answer every question. How radical are these proposals?
Well, in my view, they're very radical. They're more radical than the changes being made to the US and French forces. The 3 armoured infantry brigades are not themselves radical, but some of the organisations in force troops are. The whole concept of the adaptable force, partnership and regional alignment is radical. And also the reduction in the number of HQs, as is building an increased dependence on the reserves. So the changes in the last 50 years in the Army have all been evolutionary. This is a hard yank of the steering wheel in a significant change of direction.
Yeah, and I would say also, in comparison to the previous iterations of organisation with restructuring, so future army structure next step, transformation army structure, they're all just tweaking the organisation, taking a brigade off, adding one on, changing the name of the brigades. This is the first restructuring that actually does something different. And it takes seriously what the Army had been saying, which was the need to do upstream engagement and downstream engagement much more seriously. So it restructures the Army to undertake this wider range of tasks. So as an outsider, I have to say I was incredibly surprised at just how radical was the proposal.
Well, it's radical, but it's not radical enough, if we want to go further on that. It's radical in the sense that the regular army will no longer be able to do its job, everything that is expected of it, without the reserves. It's never really been in that situation before, except medically. That was never really planned, that we drifted into that unhappy position. But where it's not radical enough, in my view, is that we are trying to cling on to a structure in the reserves which was there for an entirely different purpose. It was correct 100 years ago, where the emphasis was on putting formed units into the field to fight as formed units. Whereas really what the Army needs is fleshing out, to replace, the regular Army needs fleshing out to replace the hollowing out that the reduction in the 20,000 means. And that means really individual reservists or small groups, not a structure of a TA which was originally planned for the defence of these islands against initially French invasion and then German invasion, through developments in the 1930s and during the Cold War to at maximum effort to go and fight in Germany, which in retrospect probably wouldn't have been a great success story. I think that would be my starting point, Chairman.
Yes, it is certainly very different, but from what Professor Farrell says, not necessarily bad as a result of being very different. But my next question is, if you were part of a red team saying this is all up for questioning and we want to point out where the flaws are in this plan, what would you be saying?
So I start. The context, of course, is that the government is seeking to spend less by having less forces that do less. So defence planning assumptions at the outset of the Strategic Defence and Security Review were ratcheted down. And this is important because the organisation envisages producing less boots on the ground in whichever scenario you envisage. Now, there are some scenarios you can envisage where that doesn't matter, but stabilisation, counterinsurgency, operations in difficult and complex terrain, for example, jungle, and the urban fringe of a jungle, the less boots on the ground are going to be a limitation. It's also clear that the Army's NBC defence capability has significantly reduced, which in the light of events in Syria may represent a weakness. And it's also very dependent on the delivery of the capability by reserves and the modernisation of the helicopter and armoured vehicle fleet. And there is a lag between the reduction in the size of the army, the regular army, and the adoption of the new organisations, both of which are going to be complete in 2015, and the full delivery of the reserves capability in 2018, and also the plans for the modernisation of the armoured vehicle fleet, particularly the Scout programme and the utility vehicle programme that replace armoured vehicles that are essentially obsolete. Those, of course, aren't coming in till the end of the decade, if not beyond. So I think that represents some of the major risks.
I think there's only one flaw that we can say at present, and that is the whole thing is predicated on the ability to raise 30,000 reserves and then progressively integrate them in a deployable force, starting from individual augmentees to whole units. And whilst, for instance, the Americans have been able to use reserve forces in this way, the recent history, the British haven't been able to deploy whole units into the field. More to the point, as we know, there are very significant problems that they're encountering with Operation 45, the operation to raise the reserve force. So that's the flaw, right? Is that if you can't raise the size of the reserve force you require, if you can't get the flexible contracts that enable you to use them in a certain way, then the whole of Army 2020 is questioned.
Just go on from Professor Farrell's point. What is the plan B if it's clear in 2 or 3 years' time that we're not going to raise these numbers, and yet at the same time we're taking the economy measures. We are sending away experienced troops. We are disbanding battalions. We are cutting the ORBAT very significantly. I would have liked to see an overlap period. I can see why there hasn't been an overlap period. I understand that. But nevertheless, I think the early pointers suggest that maybe the rate of attenuation of the regular forces needs to be slowed down somewhat. I think there is room to do that. I think getting back capability once you've laid it off is a much longer business than people sometimes think. For example, I've heard it said, and sadly I've heard it said by people in uniform, that, well, if we need to raise a couple more infantry battalions come the day, that won't be too difficult. Funnily enough, in my view, infantry take longer to produce good infantry than almost any other part of the army. It's an art, not just an industrial skill. And it is on the infantry that the burden of most operations do fall. So I would like to see some sort of bridging contingency plan. I think the other thing that I would say is that, and going on from the earlier point I made about trying to retain an old structure, the OTA, I hear those voices who say, well, the structure would be the basis for regeneration if necessary. I'm not convinced that the reserves are the right basis to regenerate. We've not had demonstrable success in that area in the last 100 years. I would like to see a much more centralised focus on recruiting and training and administering recruits, rather than having your laydown of platoon and company and battalion bases all over the country, and finding that a lot of them, at great expense, are in fairly barren areas as far as recruiting is concerned, and administratively difficult, while at others they're almost dealing with too many interested parties. And I could give I was talking to the commanding officer of a logistic regiment 3 weeks ago who explained to me just this problem. He had his laydown as given to him. 2 of the areas, parts of industrial north, were for curious reasons totally unproductive. There was one centre where unemployment was high, there was no other game in town, and that particular squadron of his was over-recruited. He wasn't allowed to take on any more, but had he had the flexibility to run the operation as a whole, his entire effort will be put onto that productive area. Does it matter where they come from in the end, as long as they're in uniform and accessible?
Thank you. We'll come on to some of these issues during the course of the next few minutes. Deliverability.
Can I just ask this? You talk about a bridging plan, then you're talking about sequencing of various things, equipment and the periods of time that things come together to make the whole for 2020. It seemed to me that you suggest, therefore, in terms of the planning process and the sequencing of the events that come together, there is a vulnerability in making, from now until 2020, that there are weaknesses in achieving the process. For example, 2018 presumes that you will have completed the reserve recruitment. There are a series of assumptions in the process that gets you to 2020. Could you perhaps say something more about that? Because there will be a defence review in 2015, there will be a general election, if not before. So there are other things that may well cause a revision of the plan. So is the plan a complete plan, or is the plan actually a set of aspirations towards a plan, and there are weaknesses and vulnerabilities before you get there?
Okay.
Well, the plan was a very well developed plan, carefully developed plan, as you know, probably based on operational experience and a very large amount of experimentation. And so that was all well and fine. But the Army's been enduring a succession of cuts, and there are more coming. And that's where the problem lies, right? The next round of cuts, which are bound to come, which will reduce the force down further, the regular force. And that's when you begin to ask, is this workable? So the key question actually is, can you achieve Army 2020, both in the context of a failure to achieve the reserve targets and further reductions in the regular force?
So the weaknesses are in the application of the plan, not the plan.
Correct.
So, can I just ask, that is your question. What is your answer to it?
Go back to the drawing board.
You would go back entirely to the drawing board?
Well, put it this way, unless there is, let's say, unless there are significant progress in terms of the future reserves recruitment, and unless the cuts that we can anticipate down the line to the regular army are modest, but if they're on the scale of another 15, 20,000, then sure, you have to go back and look at this thing much more carefully.
Okay. Brigadier Barry.
On reserves, I'm a glass half full man, because 10 years ago I had the privilege of commanding a brigade in Bosnia that had substantial numbers of US Army Reserve and National Guard, and also Australian and Canadian reserves. And those were much closer in many ways to what is now envisaged for the Army Reserve than the then model of the TA, although I also had a TA Signal Squadron and Medical Squadron. So to a certain extent I've seen the future and know that it can work, and we shouldn't forget that in a country where hundreds of thousands of people volunteered for the Olympics, where there's a thriving voluntary sector, the reserves have a unique selling point, which is almost alone amongst voluntary organisations. They offer pay and a bounty. But the sequencing of the plan, I think you've identified, and if there's one thing the Army's always pretty good at, it's planning in exhaustive detail, and I'm conscious that that is going on in Army headquarters and the General Staff in London. But I think there are 2 higher level risks. One of them is funding. Well, in the short term, it's been agreed that there can be a 1% increase to equipment and support, and also the government is now implementing the recommendations of the Armed Forces Pay Review Body. Well, of course, in a fixed budget, those have the potential to squeeze out other stuff, including, for example, infrastructure, training, barracks, and conditions of service. In the long term, of course, historically, Army equipment programs have often been squeezed out by cost growth in the other two services equipment programs. We're now into a new model of financial management, and it will be interesting to see if there is cost growth in air and maritime programs, or for that matter in the future deterrent, whether those organisations will have to swallow their smoke and the Army budget will not be raided. But that's a historic risk. And clearly, as other speakers have alluded to, funding in the next Strategic Defence Review is a factor. But I think there's an important operational factor, and that is that the army that's being created to go on operations will depend on more timely political decision-making to mobilise the reserves, and indeed to get the adaptable force to be adapting in whichever direction it's required to adapt for the operation, requires time. So premium on early political decision-making. And of course, a decade ago, we had the penalties of the lack of appropriately timely decision-making illustrated to us with, for example, the logistic problems in Operation Telly.
So
But it's
Bob,
built in now.
Sir Bob Russell. Although I have to say, you are answering before we ask for some of the questions that we were intending to ask.
Precisely.
Sir Bob Russell.
Gentlemen, what happens if the Army fails to recruit those 30,000 reservists?
If you want to meet the operational output, you've got two choices. You either stretch the elastic band of the regular army so they all become much busier and go outside tour intervals and harmony guidelines, or you rebuild the capability of the regular army, though you wouldn't need to rebuild it by 30,000.
At what point then does the Ministry of Defence have to tell the government it's not working? 30,000 reservists are not being recruited.
There's two things here. One is you go back and relook again at defence planning assumptions. So that the Army 2020 is predicated on the planning assumptions in the SDSR, and that was for an army of 95,000, a regular army of 95,000. We're now at an army of 82,000. We may go down to 72 or 62. So the first thing you do is you go back to the defence planning assumptions and go, okay, these aren't going to work anymore. And of course, government will be slow to do this. It's quite likely government will want to be able to maintain, in policy terms, the claim it can achieve certain things for domestic and international political reasons, and simply ignore the problem. So that's, government has to come on it for that one. And the other is whether you look again at the harmony guidelines, because the only way you can stretch the army is by being honest with troops and saying we're going to have to deploy you on a more regular basis, and we have to renegotiate that.
So are you telling me that Army 2020 is not of a sufficient size to deliver what is intended?
In the SDSR, of course.
It is or it is not?
It's not.
It is not.
It's right. Certainly, if there are any more cuts, it won't be. That's fairly obvious.
Gentlemen, have you had any reaction from allies and NATO about what is happening and what may happen if the reservist numbers are not reached?
I've spent a week in Washington, D.C. in March, and the experts I talked to in think tanks and people in the Pentagon were concerned with the overall reduction in capability of the British Armed Forces. They weren't particularly interested in the granular detail. And indeed, with the size of the National Guard, the Army Reserve, the Marine Corps Reserve, and the Air National Guard, they would find it very surprising were the UK not to be able to meet this relatively modest target. And I would pray in support of the changes that are being made to the reserves, that they do take them more in the direction of some of the strengths of the reserves in the US Armed Forces. I think if we're talking about a scenario where the Army fails to meet its target for the reserves by a significant margin, which clearly would cause there to be an uncomfortable conversation between the Army and the government. But does there not need to be a conversation now between the Army and the Defence Secretary and the whole of government. Because if government is to make this work, the whole of government needs to put its shoulder to the wheel. Now, to his credit, Secretary of State Hammond has been talking about this and doing his best to project the image. But do you see the image from the other government departments? Do you see the Transport Secretary encouraging major transport companies to contribute people to the reserves? Do you see the Health Secretary really congratulating the significant contribution that people from the NHS make to reserves? Because to deliver the whole package as is envisaged requires more than just the Ministry of Defence and the Army.
You're calling for joined up government.
Yes.
I think, if I may,
It's very interesting. We want to take a sort of historically informed look at this. 100 years ago, when that great man Haldane, Liberal, was restructuring everything, what really strikes you is the degree to which ministers across the government are committed, and they get out into the into the highways and byways to advance this new organisation that has been set up to encourage recruiting. Ministers of all persuasions are out there opening new OTCs and whatever. Total commitment. And real evidence of belief in this. You read diaries and letters, and they're communicating with each other in a truly interested way. It's not just an initiative of one department that is being run with. I think the other thing, two other things, if I may. I think senior officers are in a difficult position, of course, because they're part of the delivery of this. Although going out and finding the reservist recruits is not a military task, but for them to say it is failing is indicative of a failure on their part. It might be thought. Is there then, what is the incentive to make a noise? That is what would worry me. I see no independent judgment criteria that can say whether this thing is working or not. It's going to rely on people standing up and saying so, and that will not be without penalty.
Just very briefly.
Very briefly,
Very
please.
briefly.
Thank you, Chair.
Just say I think most American observers in the think tank world of policy don't really care. They're not really interested in this detail until it comes to a future operation when they will want us to deliver capability, and then when we can't do it, they'll care. But right now, they're not bothering. They're not following it.
No, the issue of funding has already been considered a bit. Julian Brazier, do you want to?
Yes. I want to ask a question on funding, which just ties into some of the things you've just been saying. Brigadier Barry, in your very interesting submission, you comment that MOD spending on land equipment is at an all-time low. You also made the point earlier that Americans, Canadians, Australians are all already in the kind of profile that we're trying to move towards, although we're only going halfway there. We'll end up with a much smaller proportion of volunteer reservists. In all three of those countries, it's recognised that you cannot afford the equipment for a reasonable sized overall force if you try and do it with a nearly all professional army. It's just too expensive. Do you think we should be having a go at trying to move in the same direction as the other two, or as the other English-speaking countries, or do you think that we should simply say within the current funding envelope we accept there isn't enough money for equipment and we try and have a bigger regular army, whatever it costs us? I mean, what's your? Can we start with you? Obviously, with colleagues who want to come in.
The Army's equipment capability, as planned, is going to modernise important areas, particularly armoured warfare and helicopters, as well as taking into core various urgent operational requirement capabilities that prove their worth in Afghanistan. I sense, though, that rather like many other aspects of the Army, it's at its critical mass. It's very difficult to envisage further capability being taken away without it being a real hit on capability overall. Personally, if there are extra money available, my personal priority would be to accelerate the armoured vehicle modernisation programme, particularly to replace as quickly as possible CVRT and 432 in the reconnaissance and utility roles. Those other English-speaking armies you describe, they share many similarities with ours, but there are also important differences. And the US Army, in some respects, culturally is very different. So there is a limit to how much you can benchmark from them.
But why is it? Sorry.
We've got to move on rather than get into it. Anybody else want to comment on this? Derek Twigg.
That's your views. Do you think that what's been proposed and the whole politics and commentary around the changes and the cuts as well is really giving a message which is sort of negative to people out there, saying the army's not that important anymore and the defence is not as important anymore. In fact, what's more important is what it costs.
Yeah, and I entirely agree, and it's quite striking actually. And my own view is that this is in part a general underappreciation of the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, Iraq is obviously deeply clouded by the politics surrounding it. But in terms of,
Can you speak up?
I'm sorry. I think it's. I'll lean forward. I think it's partly got to do with the politics surrounding Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, obviously, in the politics in Iraq are very troubling. But in terms of Afghanistan, the army has delivered a huge capability, far in excess of the Allies. I mean, the comparison with Canada and Australia just simply doesn't apply. Right? They're minions in comparison to what the British Army has delivered into Afghanistan, both in terms of command and special forces, but especially land forces. And so what we're really asking here is, do you want to continue to have an army and the ability to deliver a division-level force at strategic distance? Because aside from the United States, Britain is the only Western country that can do so. And so you have to ask questions about whether that's useful, whether in the future Britain might require this as a capability in its national interest. But Army 2020 was and is at the moment the only realistic plan to continue to have that capability. But unfortunately, further cuts are going to mean that it may no longer be, in its current configuration, affordable. But in part, I think it's just astounding how this country and the Ministry of Defence is so reluctant to promote what has been achieved in Afghanistan. There seems to be an immense nervousness around it. And instead, this is all about cuts.
Well, when you think that the sort of, in a sense then, because obviously Iraq, but also in Afghanistan, we heard what Karzai said, the last 24 hours, that actually we're running away from it. And you mentioned our division size, which I actually agree with. And you say it's only gave intel and it's only 20. Do any of you actually think that what's been proposed is going to really safeguard this country in the future? Safeguard our interests?
If I may, I return to my opening remark. The government decided to do less by having less and spending less. There have been events since the SDSR, the war in Libya, the Arab upheavals, and the conflict in Syria. And it seems to me the risk against a very turbulent and rapidly changing world, the risk that could pose a threat to UK national security, has gone up since 2010 rather than gone down. And the other thing we'd observe in the Institute is that for some of the upheaval we've seen in the past 2.5 years, the rate of change has been much greater. The Arab upheavals happened much faster than the upheavals in Eastern Europe in the late 80s. And this is because the world is much more connected. So although the Strategic Defence and Security Review is very opaque about the DPAs in terms of readiness, my understanding is readiness has been reduced. So we have less forces that are able to react very quickly, where world events suggest to me that actually we need forces that can react more quickly than they could before the SDSR rather than less.
I mean, I would say, it's most of the scenarios that Britain's likely to face in the future where it wants to deploy military force. Military force alone will not be the solution. And that's abundantly clear, right? You're going into situations where you're trying to stabilise them, build capacity and handle.
I think I know that. But what I'm saying is, what do you think we should have in terms of a military force? I mean, what do you think is actually stands up and is credible? I understand the issue about this whole range of other people and organisations have got to be involved.
No, but if you let me finish my point.
Yeah.
when we went into Bosnia to do peacekeeping, we sent in forces that weren't configured to defend themselves. And what Bosnia showed is even if you go in to do peacekeeping or peace operations where you're building capacity and handing over or stabilising a country, the situation can develop that you have to deploy combined task forces with armoured infantry. But what Bosnia showed is you have to have the ability to send in forces very fast, either pull your troops out or send in an armoured unit that's able to defend your forces in being and then stabilise the situation. So this is why 2020 is a clever design, because the focus is clearly on defence engagement, but it maintains an armoured infantry corps that, if necessary, can go in and defend Britain's interest or Britain's troops. That seems entirely logical. Otherwise, the only other solution is you deploy forces for defence engagement, such as peacekeeping. And if the situation goes pear-shaped, you have to pull them out as fast as you can because you can't defend them, or you've got to call on the Americans or somebody else to do it. And the Americans do it.
Sorry, can I? Just two quick points. First, in terms of Brigadier Barry, you mentioned about the issue of reservists and Americans, Canadians, etc. Isn't it true there's a different culture in the US, and we haven't got that culture? And the second and final question, that someone, I don't know who wants to answer this, is what does this mean for our special forces and our ability to recruit high caliber people and deliver the sort of operation we want to?
There's no doubt that culture is different in the US, but what is planned, I think, will only succeed if the culture in the reserves and in the regular forces and in wider public sector and society moves in a direction closer to the US. Special forces, clearly, with armed forces that have less people and an army that's 20% smaller, the recruiting base from which special forces are drawn is going to get smaller. However, anecdotally, there are many people who have had their share of adrenaline, got their sense of achievement from the combat operations they've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the event that after 2015 the British Army is not substantially engaged in high-tempo operations, I think there will be extra people putting themselves forward for selection for special forces because they'll want that excitement and that additional challenge that in many respects they've been getting in 1st Rifles or 2nd Duke of Lancasters over the last decade.
Okay. Madeline, thank you very much.
I wonder if, just following on from Derek's question, are we moving into an era as well, following the number of deaths that we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan, where government is looking for reduced casualties and a more remote warfare, so that we stand back and stand further removed, using perhaps ISTAR, cyber, drones to fight our wars rather than actually boots on the ground?
I don't think that's a fair question, but I don't think it's the case at all. So until Iraq and Afghanistan, the dominant view among academia was that the West had lost its appetite for war, and that we were moving to an era of war from distance, spectator sport warfare, and so forth. But in Iraq and Afghanistan, Western armies, particularly the British and the Americans, have sustained very considerable casualties and have been prepared to continue, demonstrate the ability to continue operations. So, of course, the government and the military have every reason to want to reduce casualties, but there seems to be a continued willingness to put troops in harm's way in the interest of national policy and security. So I don't think the evidence supports that at all, actually. What it does show, though, is that there's massive investment in force protection capabilities. And in our case, for instance, the very large program to acquire Mastiffs, which we're now stuck with in our equipment program. So there's questions around the extent to which money will be spent to protect troops, but that seems reasonable enough. The only thing that might speak to what you're saying is the Supreme Court ruling that says that gives families the right, of course, to sue government for negligence. That could open the door a bit, but it's not in terms of the military's appetite or government's appetite.
If I may, I slightly take what I think is your proposition, that there's a bit of an aversion right now to boots on the ground because they're seen as carrying a risk of messy escalation and indeed a risk of casualties that will be difficult to explain. And of course the reason because of this is the ever-increasing unpopularity of the Iraq War and the way the Afghanistan War got contaminated with that. And that led to extraordinary measures of force protection being implemented that had not been implemented in Northern Ireland or the Balkans campaigns. And what I sense is that there is a great risk that that becomes a sort of default setting. It becomes part of the cultural landscape, not just in the armed forces, but also in the Ministry of Defence, government and the media. And to me, the very interesting example is the recent French operation in Mali, where my understanding is we not only had very rapid political decision-making in Paris, but we also had operations conducted by the French ground troops and special forces that were well outside the risk envelope of recent British operations in Afghanistan or the successful role of British forces in Libya. And that, of course, is part of getting back to contingent operations in a new theatre rather than routine operations in a mature theatre. But it seems to me that military commanders of all three services will need to be empowered to be able to make these hard judgments on risk without having to refer them through long processes to PJHQ in London or indeed the Environmental Health Advisor.
Can I take you back then to your assessment of the role envisaged for reserves in Army 2020? How will Army 2020 affect the ability, the role of the reserves in Army 2020, affect the Army's ability to work collaboratively with the other two services?
I don't think it will reduce it at all. I mean, there have been tremendous advances in air-land integration and also in the air weapons and capabilities that enable precision strikes. And I detect a thirst on the part of the Army and the Air Force to keep those skills alive. And the embedding of the Joint Air-Land Organisation in Air Command rather than the Army is symbolic of that. I don't think the proportion of reserves will make any difference to that. Where I think there is a possible lacuna is in the last decade the Army has hardly worked with the Royal Navy. And indeed the plugs and enablers that would enable a brigade, division or corps headquarters to work alongside an air force don't seem to exist at the same level to an Army land force that had a coastal flank, which the Navy was operating on. It's also the case that compared with the Army and the Air Force, the Royal Navy seems to have underinvested in UAVs and indeed in precision firepower to attack land targets. So it certainly strikes me there's a bit of work to be done, mostly actually by the Navy, on making itself better able to support a land force.
Capita is said to have run out of capacity to recruit the required numbers of reserve forces, and we are now diverting, I understand, 1,000 troops to soldiers that are being sent out on recruiting duties. How do you feel about that? Is that an appropriate use of 1,000 members of our armed forces?
I mean, so there was two problems with the reserves, it seems, with Operation Fortify. The first problem is precisely that, I think as has been suggested, you're comparing it to countries like the United States where there's a completely different culture, right? The United States is at war, has been for over a decade. People believe they're going off to war, and that is the culture that the population has, and so hence they're prepared to mobilise and go overseas for very long stretches. Their family will tolerate it, and it's valued by society. We don't talk about being at war here in Britain. We talk about being on campaign. And so you have to fundamentally change how people view current campaigns and also military service. And that requires, at the highest level, political engagement by the Prime Minister. And as of yet, we haven't seen that. So we haven't seen the government throw its weight behind the reserves. This is not for the Army to do. Simply, it's for the Ministry of Defence. It's also for number 10, actually. The second is just an IT problem. Capita is having an IT problem integrating with DII, and so it's a quite technical thing. And so if the fix is to get troops out there, in other words, this is this partly technical issue of the integration between Capita's IT database and the DII defence database. If the solution is to get 1,000 troops out and they're to spare, sure, why not? I mean, this is critical. If it doesn't work by 2018, or even by 2020, well then you've got a major problem. So if you've got to solve the problem by getting 1,000 troops out, yeah, it's a good use of them.
I think if I may say so, the line of that question suggests still that reserves and regulars are separated by a brick wall. And I think that a lot of the young regulars that I talk to, whilst whilst very realistic about what the limitations are of reservists, are surprisingly open to the idea of integration, and see that wall as being, yes, there might be a little ditch in the ground, but there are plenty of logs lying across it, over which you cross in both directions. So I don't see it as anything that would strike any alarm note.
I wasn't referring to any conflict between regulars and reserves.
No.
It was much more a case of, given the stretch that we've got and the cuts the army has faced, is the use of 1,000 soldiers in recruitment an appropriate use of 1,000 personnel when we're cutting personnel?
Well, we are sort of, whatever the verb not to stretch is. We are not a stretch now. I say we. I've been out for so long, but let's face it. There are regiments now who are getting back to the routine of training and discovering the challenge of training generically rather than mission specific. I had an email this morning from a commanding officer who just finished training on the prairie in Canada, full of enthusiasm, saying, my goodness, you should see this regiment getting back to just training rather than training for Afghanistan.
Well, that again is a question we were going to ask about, preparing for a war rather than the war. So thank you. We now no longer do. That's very helpful evidence. What is your view about the partnering of reserve units with regular units?
I think it's a brilliant idea. I spent 5 years in the General Staff responsible for reserve policy more than a decade ago, and one of my frustrations was that the handling of reserves then suffered by having too little time spent on it by the key top drawer people in the army. It was often a province of the staff officers from the bottom drawer. What the concept of partnering does is it makes sure that the chain of command has to roll its sleeves up and get involved in helping the reserves and helping them deliver their capability. So it becomes a main effort for the A-team. So it has to be good news.
What about the deployment of formed units or formed subunits?
So, that would happen in the Army 2020 design. The assumption is that you have a sliding scale, depending on risk and complexity of the operation. But if it's an enduring operation that requires you actually to deploy whole units into an operation that's very complex, it would happen over time, so over a number of 6-month cycles. And that seems like a reasonable plan. It gives you enough time to gear up a reserve formation for training, get it into training, and then deploy it. The experience of the Americans, by the way, and they've done this for years in Iraq and in Afghanistan, is they will take whole units out, regular units, and just drop a National Guard unit in its place. And sometimes they perform better, actually, than the regular unit. Depends on how permissive the environment is. If it's a lot of combat, they sometimes don't perform so well. So it is certainly possible to imagine whole units going in, depending on the complexity and how much combat is involved. And the Army 2020 allows the time for the Army to prepare a reserve unit for such a tour. So it's in the design. It's perfectly reasonable, clever design, actually.
How realistic is it to deprive a workforce in one particular area or employers in one particular area of an entire formed unit from that area?
Perhaps I could answer that. Is that not what's happened with the provision of field hospitals over the last decade? And it's been managed, and it hasn't brought the NHS or the private health sector to a grinding halt. I've seen this done. 10 years ago, I not only had a TA signal squadron that had been given 18 months' notice, I had a TA British Army medical squadron that had been mobilised at 3 months' notice for relatively benign, stable operation in Bosnia. But I also had a Canadian infantry company and platoons and company-sized units that performed pretty well in a wide variety of roles in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 10 years. The two things that are key is, first of all, that you've got a reason, you've got the relevant baseline of training and readiness in the unit from which that capability is drawn, and secondly, that it gets sufficient warning time and a decent opportunity to do the training and the administration and everything else that's necessary. But it's been done, and it's been done by other Commonwealth armies, so it shouldn't be a problem in the future, provided, of course, that the reserve is comprised of people who've gone into it with their eyes wide open, knowing that this is what is involved. And for people who can't make that commitment, well, perhaps they shouldn't be in the reserve. They should be in some other voluntary activity if that's what they want to contribute to the community.
I think we could go on with this evidence session for at least another hour without any difficulty on our part, and from the looks of things, or from yours. And I'm sorry that we're going to have to draw it to an end now, but we have other witnesses that we have to see. We're most grateful to you. Many thanks. Now, if we could have a swift turnaround, I'd be grateful. I've just been admonished for being headmasterly, but we've still got a lot to get through. So, can I say welcome? I'm afraid we're starting this second session a bit early, so you've been rather bounced. But anyway, welcome to this session on the Future Army 2020. And this panel is to discuss the reserves element, which is obviously a huge part of it. I won't ask you each to introduce yourselves, because we've got to finish this within an hour in order to allow those members of the committee who are also members of the Defence Reform Bill to get to that committee meeting. So can I begin, please, by saying that General Wall has told us that the plans for Future Army 2020 are radical. How radical would you say they were? You don't, by the way, for those of you who weren't here for the beginning of the last session, you don't each have to answer every question, which will be, I have no doubt, a relief to each of you. General Brims, would you like to begin? You look as though
I would agree that they are radical, because the world has changed, and the way that we are preparing our forces has had to change with that. And we've structured, certainly, the army, whilst at one level you've gone back as a result of the independent commission to a balance between regular and reserve that was hitherto more normal than it became in the more recent 10-15 years. And there are other aspects of it. You were touching on in the last session, the pairing of units, which hasn't happened before, that you're going to have armed forces that they're going to be, the vast majority of which are going to be based in this country rather than overseas. So there are a huge amount of different changes taking place at the same time, of which the reserve component and the move towards a whole force, I think, is a big change.
Right to
I would concur with everything that Robin says, but I'd probably add that in saying that it's radical, there are whole aspects of it which are continuance of what we've seen as common and best practice over the last 10, 20, even more decades than that. I mean, I think one needs to register that, for example, reliance on the reserves goes in and out of vogue. But the one thing that's been clear to me in the last 50 years is the army has always had a degree of reliance on it. The thing that makes this radical is a proper recognition of it and the ability to draw on it in a way which is more pragmatic than might always have been the case in the past.
General Law.
Yes, I think I'm in the Air Vice Marshal's camp. I don't think what we're asking of reserves is necessarily radical. I think the commitment that the Army has made is radical, because there have been many reviews where we've talked about integration and more usable, and that has not been translated into fundamental change. So I think that commitment to whole force manning is radical, but actually what we're asking our reservists to do, and all components thereof, including the employers, is not necessarily that radical if you look at what we've been doing since the Balkans, and indeed even before that with the commitment to the Cold War.
Thank you. And from a business point of view, Mr. Cherry and Mr. Ehrman, do you see it as radical? Do you see it as a major change, or have you not seen sufficient evidence of that yet?
I don't personally feel it is radical as far as employers supporting their reserves. What I do think it needs to be recognised is that they need to have adequate training, adequate kit and everything else to make this work. So in that respect, we've gone through these feast and famine cycles over time with the reserve forces. And I think there needs to be a strong recognition that the support has to be there, the right kit and everything else has to be in place to make this happen. Okay. I think society, though, has changed as well. And I think we also highlighted this in our submission, that society generally these days has lost contact. The MOD has been working in its own silos, and I think we need to make that connection work properly if we're to get this to be underpinned by the society at large, and to get most employers to support it as they would wish.
Would the IOD agree with that, Mr. Ehrman?
I'd have a slightly different take. I'd say they are radical. I'd say the expectations are pretty radical on employers and on workplaces generally. I'd say on the positive side, that radicalism is well-intentioned. I can see the objectives, but perhaps we'll get on to this later, but I do think in some cases actually there are elements of poorly evidenced reasons for some of the actions that have been taken. So I think there are instances in the proposals that put forward that seek to deliver greater levels of employer participation in the efforts to try and garner higher numbers of reservists, but I think in some cases the energies are being allocated to the wrong areas.
We will come on to that, but if we don't, could you insist somehow that we do, please?
Please, yeah.
Thank you. Now, if you were being critical of these plans, which I won't require you to be necessarily, would you say they had been fully and properly tested? Vice Marshal Luca.
I don't think they have been fully and properly tested, other than on paper. The proposition that was set out at the start, which the Commission produced, on paper looks as though it's entirely achievable, but there are elements within it that still need to be tested more thoroughly than they currently are. The real implementation of the plan is relatively young, but it's happened quickly. And I think whereas the Commission recommended a phased approach to the introduction of this change, from our perspective, I think we would say that those phases have been blurred into a single entity. And that's prevented some proper experimentation, some proper development in areas where there's been an urgency to press on. Because of that, I think we are already seeing practical problems. But certainly from our perspective, no lack of commitment from the senior levels of both the political and military leadership to make it work. But if you were to focus on but one thing, and I'm sure you will, which will be the achievement of recruiting at the moment, you can see that there are elements of that which are not fully tested at all and urgently do need to be redressed.
When you say from our perspective, each of the three of you military men is on the external scrutiny group,
yeah.
The reserves. So was it from the point of view of that group that you're speaking?
It is, and perhaps Robin, if I may, I was just going to say that we had about 6 months to look at this over the course of the last year in which we reported first. And these were problems that were hinted at but not yet manifest. In the course of this year, they are becoming more obvious.
We will come on to recruiting, as you suggest. If you were in a red team mode and looking for successes and flaws in this plan, what would you say they were? General Lawler.
No, I mean the only concern, as Paula has said, is that the plan. I don't have a problem with the plan at all. The substance of the plan, the Commission's report and its translation into the plan. The timelines is the key issue, and I, as a experience of reservists do worry that that there wasn't enough sort of taken into consideration of where the TA was at the SDSR. The Commission referred to the TA having been in decline, and indeed our report talked about the decline being due to policy and management. And what concerns me is that all I consider everything eminently deliverable, but I do worry about the timescales, because I don't think it was factored into that it would take some considerable time, effort and resources, which are being applied, to get the TA back to a steady state that it enjoyed before resources for justifiable reasons were taken away from the TA for the greater importance of operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Are you therefore concerned that what that will mean is that a push to make the number might sacrifice the quality?
Well, I think that's always a danger when you're pushing people through the sausage machine, regular or TA. That's not really what I'm concerned about. But I am concerned about the command and control of TA units because of this decline. We've particularly in those combat service support units, which really weren't needed for Afghanistan. You've got a very considerable reduction in the capability of the officer corps, the senior NCOs, because there was no purpose to serving in those regiments. Now that takes a long time to recover. You don't do a recruiting, you get lots of phase 2 trained soldiers. But to get those senior NCOs, to get those good Territorial Army commanders back up to that level, you're definitely talking about 2020 as opposed to 2015.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you. General Brims.
I think because of the timescale challenge, in our report we said there need to be more metrics that you can measure how the build-up is going, so that you have some waypoints, so that you can take mitigation action to get things to a better, so that you reach the end. Because I have no doubt, this is an achievable plan. The question is it achievable in the timescale given? And I think the other piece, if I was on the red team, there's a certain amount of the reorganisation that's been done, and therefore there is some re-rolling of usually subunits, and there is a danger there may be a self-harm of people not stepping up to be re-rolled and choosing to leave. That could be a problem, and it's something we should be looking at. But equally, the other half of your question, what are the positives? There are positives. And the foremost positive is there is a proposition now, which there wasn't before, to make this an attractive proposition for the reservist, and I hope in turn for his or her employer. And I think the other big positive as part of that proposition is the whole force. I think that changes things very significantly. And the whole for a wholly integrated force. That itself will take time to change, because some of the things of cultural change which go in with that cultural change takes time.
Vice Marshal Luca, do you want to add to that?
No, I'd reinforce the cultural change, because it will, the challenge will be different at different levels within the services. And essentially you're talking about growing out of the minds of reasonably well-established senior NCOs and middle-ranking officers, the idea that there is a division between the two, and they have to work in unison in a way that has not been the fashion over the last couple of decades.
Thank you. Derek Tweed.
Some of the contributors on the forum we have in the Army Women's Service have expressed scepticism within the Army about whether this can be achieved. How committed do you think senior officers are to be able to achieve this, from your knowledge?
We have been briefed by the senior officers of the Army, and there's no question they are committed to this. This plan's got to work. And they are committed to it, there's no doubt. Now, that message is going to take time to percolate down to the more junior ranks. And we certainly have seen, both when we've been in our official capacity and most of us in unofficial capacities, we've heard comments, remarks made by the more junior end of the Army, which are certainly still questioning and are doubtful about it. Equally, sometimes they don't necessarily know what the plan is themselves, at the biggest picture, and secondly, frequently I find myself talking to sometimes young officers who have returned from Afghanistan unaware that they've got reservists who've been deployed with them in their unit. There's a positive and negative in that, because if they're unaware, clearly the reservists performed perfectly satisfactorily. But they weren't aware, that's the negative side. So I think that is part of the cultural change that the reservists view.
I mean, it's quite difficult because I have a lot of sympathy for those soldiers, because what they're not interested in a plan. What they're looking forward to is a change in their circumstance, in their TA centre, in their subunit, in their regiment. And one of the problems with this, again, I go back to my example of a CSS unit. You didn't have a role before SDSR. You still actually haven't got a role. So 3 years later, we still haven't got new operational roles to give a sense of purpose, so we can then deliver the proposition. So if you're a soldier on the proverbial gun park, you're still waiting. Great words from great men are tremendous. And I would actually, for the record, I would like to say, we were very impressed with CLF's plan, DG Reform's work. It's a very credible plan. But of course, it's the delivery of that plan and the effect that will actually have on our soldiers' life, the proposition.
Can I just ask one final question from me? There's been a major change in recent years in terms of the way people are employed. 0-hour contracts, temporary contracts, agency work, people having 2 or 3 part-time jobs. A significant change over the last 5 years or so. Do you see any way that might hinder the recruitment of people into the reservists? I mean, clearly in the past we had very large companies who were able to work much more closely, etc. with the TA. We've had the SMEs taking the greatest part of the employment market for quite some time now. But in terms of the way people are employed, do you think that has some implications for recruitment?
I mean, I personally think on balance it's a positive rather than a negative. I accept you could argue either way. I mean, one message that I've always got going around when I was still a soldier...
How is it positive, sorry?
Well, positive because there's a lot more flexibility in people's time. If you look at the TA, at least 50% is judged to be self-employed, unemployed, in further education. And even those who are in employment, a lot more than in my generation, you're looking to change job quite frequently. You're not beating yourself up, but you're looking for employment continuity. So from that respect, they've got a lot more flexibility. Is one of their part-time careers their military service? Am I going to go into volunteer for mobilisation? Am I going to volunteer for full-time reserve service? So they're working that within that portfolio that you describe in modern employment.
I'd add one thing to that. I mean, I agree with everything Major General Leather said there. I think there are greater opportunities for flexibility. What I would say, though, is what that does mean is if you are working 2 or 3 jobs, you probably have 2 or 3 employers. And that does mean that there are more employers actually now who, in a single instance of one individual, are effectively employers of reservists or will be employers of reservists. So it does mean the ramifications of the policies set out here actually will be greater than they have been in the past.
Add to that from a slightly different perspective, because I think that's absolutely right. But I also think that one of the things that has yet to work its way through, which I certainly saw hinted at, if not promised in the white paper, is the obligation of the service to the employers to make deployment opportunities more flexible to accommodate the individual, the employer, and Defence's requirements in all of this.
We'll come on to that later on during the course of this session. Madeline Moon.
Will the £5,000 bounty be successful in encouraging ex-regulars to re-engage as reservists?
Yeah. I don't know that the 5,000 bounty in its own right will, but there's some evidence already that ex-regulars are moving across into the reserve. The numbers are relatively small, typically half a dozen a month at the moment. But it would certainly alert people to the possibility of doing it in a way that just a basic advertising campaign wouldn't. I also suspect it will very much depend on what type of regular we're looking for to move across.
£5,000 is hugely attractive to some, probably wouldn't make an enormous difference to others, depending on what second career they were moving into.
Capita is said to have run into difficulties in recruiting reserves, and 1,000 soldiers have been redeployed to take on recruiting roles. Do you see that as an appropriate use of our soldiers?
Well, from our point of view, we are here charged with reporting on the plan to expand the reserve. So I can't really answer that question because it's outside our remit. But what I would say is that we're fully aware that there is a problem with recruiting at the moment. In our report that we produced in the summer, we deliberately didn't go into the numbers, and that was something which we'll be looking at in the second half of this year, because the baseline was still being sorted out, the plans were being created. The problem I don't know about the problem with the partnership between the Army and Capita to do the recruiting, but clearly it's there. There is no evidence that I'm aware of that that people don't want to join. That's a separate thing. So that from that point of view, there are people, I think, and we have anecdotal evidence throughout our RFCA structure, that there are people who want to join the reserves, but they're having difficulty getting through the mechanical processes of doing it. I'm pleased to see that somebody is taking action to mitigate the problem, and I hope that in their mitigation of the action, if the numbers aren't there in the short term, there is a mitigation plan to make for greater numbers that will need to be there at a later stage if there will be knock-on effects in the plan.
Mr. Cherry, my intuition tells me that Mrs. Moon is about to ask you a question directly in any event, but if you'd like to answer that question as well.
Yes, I'm not aware of the issues that Capita may or may not have, but the FSB has always held the view that government actually needs to be recognised in the contribution that small businesses make and could make if they reached out to them far better and not just use providers to deliver what they think are the numbers that they require.
We're told that that's purely technical problems in this shortfall. That isn't the evidence that we're hearing across the board. What's your view as to why there's a shortfall, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think, as clearly came out in the discussions that we've had with the MOD has for far too long been working in a silo mentality. It has not reached out to employers, and I think that is a fundamental sea change that has been recognised. We have yet to see it implemented and put into practice, though.
In what way? Can you expand on that?
Well,
how would you like to
business organisations can help support the government by informing our members, but collectively we probably only represent around about 500,000 members out of the 4 million plus that are supposedly out there. And I think you've got to take that fact into account, that whether it's the IOD, whether it's the FSB or the other business organisations, we can but inform our members, we can but get the information in front of them. But we're only touching the surface, quite frankly, and government has a duty, I feel, to actually communicate far more effectively on a lot of policies, and not just on this.
You heard from Professor Farrell just before, well, we heard from Professor Farrell just before your evidence session, that there was a role for all government departments, and particularly for number 10. And I think Brigadier Barry said the same thing. Do you agree with that? Do you think that there isn't enough shouting about the national importance of this plan?
I think we highlighted the fact, again in our submission, that there need to be public recognition of those reservists and particularly those employers who were supportive of this plan. We have the initiative that's in place now, but there has been no communication publicly about that as far as I'm aware. And I think the government really has got to step up to the mark on this.
If I might add something on this as well, I think we researched, it was a little while back now, quite a few years back, but we researched amongst our members the relative views that they held on different types of outside work activity of their employees. And reservist service was held in the highest esteem of all of those types of activities. and it's something I'm sure we'll get onto, but I do think, tied into your question, one of the assumptions I think that's unfortunately been made in the proposals here is that there are significant obstacles on the part of employers, placing obstacles, and indeed on the part of employees in partaking of reservist service. Certainly on the employer side, I see no reason why employers are not supportive and wanting to assist as pre-proposal stood. And so one of the key things I would emphasise is that actually this is about facilitating demand, and that requires a great deal of noise and a kind of revivify the need to recruit individuals into reservist roles, rather than necessarily assuming there are some significant policy or procedural hurdles that stop that taking place.
Not enough noise.
Yeah.
Adam Holloway.
Yeah, this is directed to Mr. Hammond and Mr. Cherry. I know a young person with a first-class degree with 5 years of extraordinary working life thus far, who was trying to get a job with one of the big headhunting firms, and got literally to the sort of final chat with the sort of the partner figure, and was asked what they did in their spare time, and this person said that they were joining the TA, and the offer was not forthcoming, and they're absolutely convinced that it was at that moment that the interest disappeared. How can you make it more attractive to grown-up employers like that to take people who are going to be in the TA and who are going to take a lot of time off inevitably if they're going to do what the government's after?
It's a good question. I think first off, I'd be very interested in that person's details, because I'm sure some of our members would be very keen to have that person work for them.
I'll take you up on it.
But
I suspect you'll be getting an email.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that. One of the things I would say is, I hear your example, but I can't help but feel the examples I have heard of this type of activity still remain anecdotal. The vast majority of the evidence I hear is that employers frankly hear that type of contribution being made outside work, outside studies, and are very enthusiastic. I can say this, again, slightly anecdotally, the other side. I was a reservist myself for 5 years, and with the engagement I've always had with employers, I have never had any problem with employers and being honest about my reservist activity. I would make one point here too, which I think is important, and it may not come up later. I think there remains a more significant problem in that the willingness, rightly or wrongly, of many individuals to actually say to potential or present employers anything about their reservist activity is a major issue. So, and in terms of delivering the proposals set out here, I would argue actually one of the problems is employers actually knowing who amongst their workforce are reservist.
So can I just ask it then from the other end of the spectrum to the small business perhaps owned by the proprietor with 5 or 10 employees? How does the government make it more attractive to the sort of members that you have many of, to take people who are then going to be dragged off and actually cost them money?
Well, I'm sure this will come out in the support package that's available from the government when we come on to that later on, but I think it's important to make you aware, if you haven't already got this, and that is that a lot of the evidence, as Alex says, is anecdotal. We actually tasked the MOD to come back at us on this one because we had not heard it as an organisation, and indeed nearly 90% of our members in our questionnaire said they actually wanted to be told whether or not that individual was a reservist so they could give adequate support.
And your organisation is the Federation of Small Businesses.
Indeed.
Thank you.
This whole area where someone might have 2 or 3 employers, and there was a question earlier on about people's understanding of that and whether they make it available to the employers they've already got. So training of employers and support of employers in understanding is going to be of greater need than it's ever been before then, presumably. What's your attitude towards the proposal that's being given for that training to employers? Because one reservist might have 2 or 3 employers that need to understand and support that individual for the right to return or whatever it is.
I wasn't aware that there was training being given to employers.
Well, do you think there should be training given to employers?
No, I don't, basically. I think what the government has to do, as we said a moment ago, is to actually communicate what it wants far more effectively than it is doing and get employers behind them.
So the business department, possibly people like ACAS and others, shouldn't necessarily have advice and guidance to employers about how to proceed?
Well, I think you've already got the advice and guidance, certainly on the support that Sabre offers to employers, and I think creating far more awareness of Sabre actually being in existence as well as what it can offer in support, would go a long way to help overcome that problem.
And if I might say, I mean, being very candid about this, I feel that much of what's been proposed here actually does make the environment more complicated for employers. I mean, the idea, as we may get onto later, of domestic mobilisation requirements and so on and so forth, I think does present challenges which are unwelcome. But as things stood, I do agree with Mike. I think that the vast majority of our members wouldn't feel the need for training, simply an understanding ear in respect of how policy is developed in terms of assisting their wholesale and supportive endeavour to employ reservists where they can.
Right. As I say, we will be coming on to these issues in just a moment, with Giza and Stuart particularly asking that question. Sir Bob Russell.
Would you not accept that the dialogue is two-way, and therefore employers should be encouraged by organisations such as yourself, is that those who join the reserve, and we do need more to join if the strategy is going to work, that employers should be advised of the benefits, the advantages, the skills, the training, the work ethic, which members of Manchester Armed Forces have brought upon themselves and then can bring back into the workplace when they're back as civilians?
I think we are very supportive of making our members aware of some of the advantages, but I'm also equally sure that they are very much aware of it themselves. I think what we do need to be doing is to making sure that, as I say, the government actually gets behind this and communicates it properly to employers on what is available, what support is there in particular, and that isn't always necessarily the financial support.
But it is a two-way dialogue, would you agree?
I think it is a two-way dialogue to a certain extent, but you cannot expect organisations to force our members to do something if they don't wish to do that. Equally, you can only inform them of what is available to them.
And encourage them.
Well,
Mr. M.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that is a challenging proposition. I'm not saying it's not worth pushing on the area, but as I said, many of our members are supportive. The vast majority are supportive of people's reservist activities outside the workplace. I think to ask employers to become active promoters of that type of activity, I think runs quite significant risks of causing friction within the workplace. I don't think they can advocate. I think they can say, we provide a platform for you to do this as well as other types of activities if you so wish. But to become an active, strident, ardent advocate of reservist service, I think unless it's compatible with your business or your own personal ethos and the work environment and employees you have, I think is a pretty significant ask.
We'll widen it to the voluntary sector in general then.
Well, that's an even more significant ask because you're asking employers to have to therefore commit to a whole range of activities.
Well, I'm just making an observation. I think employers have to accept there's more to life than the workplace, and their workforce contribute to more than life than the workplace.
The point has been made. General Brims and Air Vice Marshal Luke.
One of the things that we majored on in our report was there was the need for a narrative as to what the government's plan is. We've seen that narrative on the day that the White Paper was announced, within the White Paper, within the announcements of the Army on its pairing, basing. You pull those together, there is the start of a narrative. That is beginning to seep out. It's got to get to today's reservist, today's regular, tomorrow's reservist, tomorrow's regular, employers, commentators. And I heard it for the first time last week in County Durham when the Army engagement team gave a presentation, and there were about 100 employers present, plus people from schools, academies, universities. It was really good. It involved local TA, Army Reserve soldiers of a range of different ranks, making their part and engaging with. It was a presentation followed by a two-way discussion. It was first class. In my view, that's the start of it seeping out. We need to get much more.
More noise.
More noise, and it needs to be communicated, because an awful lot of people I talk to make a sort of off-the-cuff remark about the plan, and then you explain the plan to them, and they say, now I understand what the plan is, I think it might be able to work. Okay. They're arguing against something which isn't the plan.
My point was largely in support of a couple of the things that the employers' representatives have said, which is that it is perfectly possible to find examples of really good corporate social responsibility policies in supported companies that absolutely favour reservists beyond what we would have expected them to do. So there's a lot of good example out there. Where they do tend to go further is where there is a mutual defence interest. But there are other practical ways that we can also demonstrate benefit, and have done. And a decade ago, we used to run a fairly extensive programme of little exercises to take employers and junior managers out and watch their own reservist work. That's fallen into decline in recent years, and it's the sort of thing that contributes to the noise that educates.
Penny Moore.
Just wanted to ask very briefly, we often talk a lot about private sector, but anecdotally I've picked up a lot of concern from public sector employers, and in particular teachers. There always seems to be a recurring theme that those that are involved in that profession can't get the time off because of the pressures that the public sector is under. Have you encountered anything like that, and do you want to make any comments about public sector employers?
I think there have been examples where, and I think there will continue to be examples until the sort of thing we've just been talking about becomes more evident, where what happens in Whitehall is presumed then to percolate all the way through local government as well, and it doesn't. And it's not just at that level. It isn't sufficient to have, for example, a dialogue with the National Health Service. It's absolutely essential to have a dialogue with local trusts as well, to make sure that the policy that's being discussed in Whitehall is the one that's being executed down on the ground. Probably not the right place to say this, but of course we have to work with 3 devolved administrations as well. And again, what Whitehall says doesn't necessarily carry in all regards. So there is still quite a lot of work to do there. But I don't think that is institutional resistance. I think it's just the passage of information that largely gets in the way.
Julian Brazer.
Yes, I was going to ask a question about the Scrutiny Group itself, but just first, as Madeline's had to go, can we just come very quickly back to the capita contract and the current enlistment thing? I'm surprised we went over that so quickly. I mean, one unit have told me that every single applicant they've had since the new system came in has disappeared into the system without trace. I mean, General Lawler, you're a former senior head of the reserves. What are you hearing anecdotally about it?
Well, not good, that's for sure. In fact, the opposite of that. I mean, to put it in context, because I think it's important to do so. I mean, my understanding with the capital contract is that the TA, the reserves, was never part of the original scope of works. In fact, presumably, the scope of works was written a long time before FR20 was conceived. So the whole concept of them recruiting for the reserves was an add-on, which is not ideal in any situation. And I suspect Capita, or indeed any of the other bidders, really did not have the sort of detail they needed, technical specialist detail of what the challenge is to recruit in the reserves. I mean, fundamentally, in the Territorial Army, you recruit locally. Your sales force is your soldier, and he goes out there and sells the experience of being in that TA subunit or major unit. So the concept of centralising all the effort, particularly if it's going to be exclusively an IT-based system, is questionable. And of course, going back to Mrs. Moon's question, the application of manual labour to correct that flaw was a sensible command decision made by CLF. Presumably, he's given evidence before, but presumably because he knew it was not working. Now, I don't think that's a criticism of Capita. because I don't know what the scope of works were, and I don't know what the expectations are, what the MOD had to deliver from an IT systems point of view. So I certainly couldn't, this is not a criticism of Capita, but what I do know is you can create a jolly good positive marketing environment with campaigns, with a government narrative, but at the end of the day, your recruiting, the vast majority of it is done by your motivated Territorial Army soldiers supported by their local RFCAs and the likes.
And it would help, presumably, if the recruiting offices were, with their precious terminals, were open on Saturdays and not Monday to Friday, 9 to 5.
I mean, the whole of the anecdotal evidence is the IT system is not working. So if you are a recruiter from whatever yeomanry regiment, and you bring in, or one of your soldiers brings in a very enthusiastic young man or woman, you then completely lose that person because that person is then making an input on a computer. The unit has no ability to track it and mother that person. Certainly when I was a commanding officer, indeed even a unit recruiting officer, I would do everything possible to massage that person's flow through the system, and until they were in my unit, in uniform, the job was not done. They cannot do that under the current system. And that's, of course, as I say again, why CLF is trying to override that with manual resources to try and get that effort working.
Thank you. Depressing thought. The group itself, could you just tell us what what your powers are? The external scrutiny group. Could you just tell us a tiny bit about the background to it?
If I leave, you correct me as soon as I get it wrong. The basis of our work so far was largely last year and the last half of last year. In terms of the sorts of interests you may have, the first thing to make the point of is that we're not an executive group. We have no authority other than the authority to report. Our report was submitted under General Robin's signature and was received, and we had a response to it. The question really is something that will be most answered in the course of this year, I think, when we see how people respond to the observations and recommendations that we've made. And at the moment, in certain areas, it's difficult to see that they are being carried through. I think what is important within all of this, and I think we share the view, is that in order to be effective and to be listened to, it has to remain independent. And that is the added governance strength that I think we provide. I mean, as you know, there are levels of governance that were recommended and were introduced. As far as we can see, the internal governance through the programme board, and I was at a programme board meeting yesterday, is gripping its problems. But I still think it's important that there should be some form of external oversight which allows a genuine independent view on how this is being progressed.
And in our report, we have trailed those areas that we're going to look at in this next round.
A very quick supplementary. The Commission report was quite clear that this should be a permanent arrangement. Were you surprised to hear, was it the first you'd heard of it, when the White Paper suddenly announced that you only had a lifetime up to 2018 while this process is going on?
Our terms of reference actually say till 2018 or when FR20 is completed.
Right.
So I think that...
Thank you.
Could I add a supplementary?
Yes.
I think while everyone at the moment is rightly focused on delivering things like numbers, and 2018/2020 becomes the target, it's clear to understand why they see 2018 being the life of this group. Actually, the other thing that will emerge, and I'm certain over time, is that the circumstances that surround a reservist will still remain different to that surrounding a regular when it comes to their sort of life support mechanisms. And it will be quite important to make sure that those aren't just lost in the noise of integration and the recognition remains different.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Getting back to the issue of the offer to employers, Gisela Stewart.
Thank you. Just enough time to open up the page. It was interesting, you talked about developing a narrative, the recruitment is going to be very local. The white paper does suggest some incentives to actually make it worth the while for the employer to take part, whether it's financial. It recognises that you require more notice as to what the deployment is. Do you think the package which they've put together is sufficient, or is there more that could be made an offer to make it attractive to the employer?
If I can open by relating it to one of my earlier answers, which is that there was little time, little opportunity to test a lot of this, to have any experimentation. I think whilst the white paper proposes measures which are a good start, and I'm certain a good many of them will and should endure, over the life of Future Reserve 2020, I think we've got to keep open minds about being able to adapt and change and increase if we have to. But I don't think there's any evidence yet that would suggest that they're not the right way to be going at the outset.
From an employer point of view, from the Institute Directors' members' point of view, the reason why those that are not enthusiastic about reservist service or not offering or acting aggressively in this area doesn't relate to money. So actually it seems strange for me on behalf of our members to turn down the very kind and generous offer of an additional financial incentive, but I do think it is the wrong incentive. I think if you were to go down the financial incentive route, I've always personally felt that actually, given the fact that, and this isn't dog in the manger stuff, that given reservists derive two separate incomes, one as a reservist and one in their employment, they are already benefiting at a much higher level than their employer is from that relationship. It struck me that some kind of basis around sharing the bounty that they receive annually with their employer would entrench a bit more of a relationship between employer and employee and reservist that presently doesn't exist. So rather than a sort of government handout, as it were, much more of a direct relationship with the reservist activity strikes me as a more positive endeavour.
Do you have a specific view on this, what's it called, the National Relationship Management Scheme, relate for reservists and employers? Is that something that's kind of registered?
Not particularly, it has to be said. I mean, I've engaged over the years. I mean, I also in a previous job worked doing public relations work for the British Army for recruitment purposes, and I have to say I think the organisations that existed, the Reserve, the RFCAs and the Sabre organisation, strike me as perfectly reasonable vehicles for delivering most of what's necessary in terms of employer and military engagement, but perhaps resources have been the most predominant issue there rather than necessarily creating some new function.
Just one small supplement just for the ID before I'm sure Mike Cherry will have something to say. If I were to suggest that as part of the annual report your members actually report on how many reservists they've gone on the staff roll, is that something you'd think?
I think that would be an unnecessary and unwelcome burden.
Thank you.
How many did we know?
That's like for the smaller.
I think we do take a slightly different and a more pragmatic viewpoint. I think we've said at the time that the £500 a month is probably more than we would have expected, because it is the support that the business actually needs to find a replacement and to recruit that replacement that is pretty critical to our members, particularly in the smallest of micro businesses. I think one of the things that does need to happen, and I'll move on to this, because part of the parcel that is offered to employers is the benefits that reservist actually brings back into civilian employment, given the service that they undertake as a reservist. And I think here we need to be making absolutely certain that whatever accreditation is given to skills in the military is well understood and equal to what is needed in civilian employment. And I think that does not happen at this moment in time. It has to happen if you're to have that general overall package, I believe, and that is very much fundamental to how we see things helping and benefiting small businesses going forwards. Moving on from that, there also, as you'll have seen from our submission, the idea around about a general pool, or certainly a proper and effective matching service between those who are coming out of the regular forces looking for civilian employment, and also between vacancies within civilian employers and military people wanting to find civilian jobs. So I think there's areas around that could be developed going forwards in a far better way than they are existing at the moment.
And would that have to be organised on a regional basis, or would that be something you could organise on a national basis, given what we said earlier on about...
I would have thought, that should be perfectly possible through a national portal. I mean, if the IT infrastructure is there and it works effectively, then there's no reason for that. And as long as, again, it comes back to people knowing where to go and government actually communicating that these things are there. If you look at how the business link part of Gov UK is not well used, there is a communication problem there from the government side, I would suggest, that goes along with what I said a few minutes ago about far more effective communication. It is, to some extent, Andre's and Bob's thing, a two-way thing, but employers can't do it all.
Adam Holloway.
Yes, so just in support of Mr. Cherry's point, I suppose anybody over the age of 45 would have had a parent in the armed forces, therefore they would have some understanding of the sort of qualities you were talking about. Anybody under wouldn't. And that also equally applies to the people who are trying to recruit.
I think it's also important, though, to just make further points. We heard earlier from the General about the Army's awareness events. 90% of our members, when we surveyed them, said that they had never heard of these. So there's a huge communication issue there that is not reaching out to the smallest businesses.
Can I also add one quick point in response to Mr. Holloway as well, which I think is important, is one thing I don't think we've fully grasped in terms of recruitment, and this is extending somewhat beyond the IOD's direct concerns, but is a much more far-reaching recruitment campaign that uses a whole range of tools. I mean, I think quite interestingly about how the American Army use computer games as a basis for trying to sell some of this principle into people. Now, I can understand how there may be some dimensions of discussion to that particular development, but I do think that reaching out beyond what typically, certainly in my experience, was use case studies as examples within local press to demonstrate value, feels to me, I mean, though it's valuable, slightly tired, and that actually there needs to be a much more integrated, new media rich kind of attempt to attract our young people to these services.
Now we've got 5 more minutes. Penny Morton.
Yes, I've got a couple of questions. First is just about the additional training requirement, whether you have any concerns about the 40 days, whether that's achievable, or do you think that there still remain obstacles?
I personally don't see that there's an issue there unless you're an employer that's running a 24/7 operation over the weekends. To go from 35 to 40 when it's mainly at weekends or evening training, I cannot see being a significant issue unless you are having to travel much further to your training bases from where you actually have done in the past.
I mean, I would say it's not significant. I mean, the 5 days is not material. It's an extra. 40 days translates to roughly 10 weekends a year, evenings, and your 2 weeks FTX. When I was a commanding officer, we were doing 50 to 60 days, and no one blinked. So it's only significant because it's shown as an increase, but it's not an increase from an already demanding level. It's a very moderate demand, 35 man training days a year, so the increase is not significant.
There is the other side of the coin there. Is that enough to deliver the type of readiness needed? And that's from the employer, but then from the military, the user point of view, is it enough? But then, of course, you have to take into account that in the mobilisation phase, there will be more and more training. And 10 years ago, I deployed a force into Iraq that had 20% of it was reservist. And we'd had no top-up training. And they were okay. So it's not as dramatic sometimes as sometimes say. I mean, we shouldn't plan to do it quite like that. But there's an awful lot that you can do from a baseline that might not have been brought to full readiness. Indeed, the regulars haven't done.
Just to clarify, do you have any remaining concerns around, perhaps not the number of days, but what that training constitutes? Do you?
I don't think I have a concern about the number of days, either from the individual and their relationship with their employer, because actually those 40, 45 days take place, as it were, in that individual's private time. is there sufficient for all the different capabilities to be given the training? That's an area that we'll be looking at to make sure that that's an area that's being tested, to answer an earlier question. It's an 8-year programme.
And does that include sort of the frequency of training opportunities as well? Thank you. My other question, which has already been sort of touched on largely, Chairman, was just about the how this is going to work alongside the regulars and that integration. You spoke earlier about some of the cultural challenges, particularly amongst sort of lower ranks. Are there any other remaining concerns you have about that whole force integration?
I think there is some urgent work needed on what pairing and partnering really means. I think it would be quite easy to overface a regular unit if it felt it was taking on all of the administration and support roles that have traditionally rested with the reserve unit. And indeed, I don't think it would be healthy to move those responsibilities, because there is part of bringing on the reservist CO as a CO who can command in his own right that remains important. So I think there's still a sort of responsibility matrix that needs to flow out of it. I also think that there is a temptation within regular soldiers, or regular servicemen, two here, to claw everything to themselves because they think that's the only way problems can be resolved. Actually, a responsibility matrix which spreads all of those to the most appropriate bodies is what's needed out of this as well. And although I hope this doesn't sound like self-publicity, organisations like the RFCAs, like other support groups, can take some of that burden off regular and reservist units as well. And we should be looking to things like the covenants to provide levels of support in this as well. That suggests to me, going right back to an earlier point, the noise. We need to make sure that the noise touches a number of other areas rather than the usual suspects who we've tended to concentrate on in the course of today.
Thank you. And now the very final question, Sir Bob Russell.
Thank you. The footprint of army bases in the UK has decreased significantly over the years. So what are your thoughts on how the reorganisation of army basing review might affect the recruitment of reserves?
Well, I mean, the challenge in selecting any reserve centre is making sure it's in the right place. And one of the disappointments over the years, there hasn't been flexibility on what reserve centres you kept, developed or disposed of. And the RFCAs have been very involved in that and been looking for greater flexibility. It is stating the obvious that they need to be in the right place so they can recruit. So it's critical that the DIO allows that flexibility so we're not having TA centres in the wrong place which will flounder whatever effort we might do in good management or recruiting.
The last question is, how much does distance act as a deterrent to a potential recruit to the Army Reserve?
Less than it used to, but it still is a factor. And if I can just add to Simon's last response, it isn't just the availability of TA centres or reserve centres that's important in all of this, it's also the accessibility to training areas in reasonable travel time. If we end up with larger, more centralised training bases, that inevitably leads to more transit time, and that will be a major disincentive to retention.
So there has to be a lot of flexibility in this?
There's got to be the right balance.
Thank you.
It is 3:50. I said we would stop at 3:50. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your impeccable discipline and your interesting and helpful answers in this evidence session. I'm most grateful.